The night had settled over the farm with a familiar heavy quiet, broken only by the hum of cicadas in the garden. Then the ground began to vibrate. The harsh mechanical blare of the industrial scale's alarm shattered the silence. Tuna stood in the cool night air, clutching her thin woolen cardigan tightly around her shoulders. She stared at the glowing red digital readout in absolute disbelief. 4,020 kilograms. 4 tons, she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. The farmer standing beside the truck shifted nervously, his worn rubber boots scuffing against the dry earth. He looked apologetic, yet deeply desperate. A rumor of a massive price crash had swept through the neighboring province like a wildfire. Panic, they were learning, was highly contagious. Fearing their crops would soon be worthless, everyone had decided to harvest early. Alex stepped out from the warm glow of the half-finished factory shed, wiping thick black grease from his hands with a cotton rag. He stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't just see the massive overloaded truck idling violently in their front yard. He saw the provincial road beyond their wooden gate. Through the dense, humid darkness, a line of headlights cut through the night, kicking up a thick, choking cloud of dust. 1, 2, 5. A convoy of 15 more tractors groaned under the weight of an early harvest, stretching as far down the road as the eye could see. On the wooden porch of their home, the screen door squeaked open. Little Henry stood in the doorway in his soft yellow pajamas, rubbing his sleepy eyes. His tiny feet were half slipped into his oversized daytime sandals. He looked at the massive roaring machines, confused and frightened by the invasion of their sanctuary. The peaceful rhythm of their farm was gone. Hello everyone, welcome back to our family's home. Usually our yard is quiet, swept clean, and locked by 9 o'clock. But tonight our greatest success, the deep trust of our community, has just arrived at our doorstep, uninvited, weeks early, and in terrifying quantities. If we turn these farmers away, they lose a season's livelihood, and we lose their trust forever. But if we take it all in, we might just drown in it. By midnight, the familiar, comforting space of our front yard had transformed into a chaotic, dust-choked industrial zone. It was a symphony of roaring diesel engines, exhausted shouting, and the heavy rhythmic thud of burlap sacks hitting the concrete floor. Cassava is a beautifully resilient plant in the ground, but an unforgiving root once harvested. The moment it is pulled from the earth, a biological clock begins to tick loudly. You have exactly 48 hours to wash, peel, and process the starch before the root begins to ferment and rot from the inside out. Once that happens, the firm white flesh turns soft, black, and completely useless. Our newly built processing area was a fragile dream we had spent 2 agonizing years saving for. With its half-finished brick walls and raw concrete floors, it was perfectly designed to handle a respectable, steady 10 tons a day. It was a solid, safe system for a family business taking its first careful steps into scaling up. But tonight we were looking at 50 tons of raw, dirt-covered reality. The glaring fluorescent shop lights cast long, harsh shadows across the shed. The air was thick with a hazy brown dust and the distinct, raw, earthy smell of freshly uprooted soil. Alex was a blur of frantic motion. His shirt was completely soaked through with sweat, clinging to his back as he desperately tried to coordinate the dumping zones. He waved his arms, directing a heavy tractor to back up toward the washing vats, his voice cracking over the deafening din of the engines. He wasn't just running a business right now, he was fighting a tidal wave with a teacup. He ran from the conveyor belt to the water pump, pushing the machinery far past its intended limits, listening with dread to the strained groaning of the gears. Tu Na stood near the receiving scale, a wooden clipboard pressed hard against her chest, as if to protect her heart. Her hands, usually so steady when weaving bamboo baskets or tending to Henry's delicate vegetable garden, were visibly trembling. With every weight she jotted down onto the ledger, another 100 kilos of pressure was added to her shoulders. She slowly lowered the clipboard and looked over at the growing mountain of roots spilling across the factory floor. It was no longer just a pile, it was a geographical feature, a looming brown wall threatening to swallow their shed whole. The sheer volume of it was suffocating. There is a profound, terrifying difference between wanting your family business to grow and feeling the physical, crushing weight of that growth collapse on top of you. Ambition looks beautiful on paper, but in reality, at 1 in the morning, breathing in the dust of 50 tons of panic, ambition simply looks like a husband and wife pushing themselves to the absolute edge of human endurance, just to keep a promise they didn't know they made. By 2 in the morning, the rhythm of the work had become a mindless, exhausting loop. Lift the heavy burlap sack, empty the roots into the concrete washing vat, transfer them to the peeling drum, pull the heavy iron lever. The mechanical peeler was the pulsing heart of our new setup. It was a large steel cylinder lined with stiff, abrasive brushes, designed to tumble and strip the thick, muddy skin off the cassava in minutes. It was supposed to be our salvation tonight, the only thing keeping us ahead of the rotting clock. But machinery, unlike the human spirit, does not run on willpower or community obligation. It runs on physics. Alex had just loaded the 4th heavy batch of roots when the pitch of the motor suddenly changed. It wasn't the steady, low hum we were used to. It was a high, strained whine, like an animal caught in a snare. Alex dropped his empty sack and lunged for the emergency shut-off switch, his boots slipping on the wet concrete, but he was a second too late. A dull, heavy pop echoed sharply over the engine noise outside. The steel drum shuddered violently, grinding metal against metal with a sickening crunch, and then died. Suddenly, the most terrifying sound in the shed wasn't the chaotic roar of the tractors in the yard. It was the absolute, dead silence inside the factory. A thin wisp of acrid grey smoke curled up from the motor housing, carrying the unmistakable bitter scent of burnt wiring. Alex leaned over the machine, wiping sweat from his eyes, shining his phone's flashlight through the metal cooling vents. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The way his exhausted shoulders suddenly dropped told Tuna everything she needed to know. The main drive shaft had seized. The motor was completely blown. And right then, the humid night air shifted. The raw, earthy smell of the fresh harvest was slowly being replaced by something sharper, a faint, sour tang clinging to the moisture in the air. It was the smell of the exposed starch beginning to oxidize and ferment. The 48-hour clock wasn't just ticking anymore, it was sprinting. We were trapped. The mountain of unpeeled roots sat there, cold and heavy, staring back at us. Our grand vision of a scaled-up, modern family farm had just shattered against a broken piece of steel. Alex grabbed a heavy iron wrench from the wooden workbench, his grease-stained hands slipping frantically on the cold metal. He started loosening the housing bolts with a desperate, panicked energy, muttering under his breath about bypassing the electrical relay, about finding a way to hand-crank the massive drum. He was trying to solve a catastrophic failure with sheer, blunt force. But Tuna wasn't looking at the broken machine. She was looking at the mountain of dirt-covered roots, and then out toward the dark, dusty road where the farmers were still waiting. She calculated the grim reality. They could turn off the glaring shop lights right now, walk back into the warm, quiet house, check on sleeping Henry, and go to bed. Tomorrow morning, they could tell the exhausted farmers to pack up their ruined crops and go home. It would be the logical, self-preserving business decision. But in a rural farming community, logic doesn't feed your neighbors. If they rejected those roots tonight, they wouldn't just be losing a single season of profit. They would be destroying the very trust that had allowed them to build this life in the first place. Tuna stepped away from the useless peeler. She walked out of the shed, past her frantic husband, and disappeared into the dark kitchen. When she returned, she wasn't carrying a spare mechanical part or a tool. She was carrying a pair of thick yellow rubber gloves and a small wooden-handled paring knife. She didn't look at Alex. She simply pulled a low blue plastic stool right to the base of the massive looming pile of raw cassava. She sat down, picked up a heavy root the size of her forearm, pressed the small steel blade into the tough, muddy bark, and pulled down. Shh! The thick brown skin curled away, falling into the dirt, revealing the stark, perfect white starch beneath. Alex stopped turning his wrench. He stared at her, the absolute absurdity of the image washing over him. One tiny kitchen knife against 50 tons of root. It was an impossible, ridiculous solution. But as he watched his wife methodically reach for the second piece, a profound realization settled over the dusty shed. We spend so much time obsessing over operational efficiency, buying bigger machines and building faster systems to protect ourselves from hard work. But true resilience isn't found in an equipment catalog. True resilience is the quiet, terrifying willingness to become the gear yourself when the system fails. It is the human capacity to look at an impossible, unscalable mountain of work, sit down in the dirt, and make the very first cut. For the next 3 hours, the only sound inside the factory was the rhythmic, wet scraping of steel against tough roots. The intimidating mountain of brown dirt slowly gave way to growing, stark white piles of perfectly peeled cassava. But manual labor of this sheer magnitude exacts a brutal hidden tax on the body. Tu Na's hands, encased in those heavy yellow rubber gloves, began to cramp intensely. Small, angry blisters formed beneath the thick rubber, stinging sharply with every practiced movement of her blade. Beside her, Alex sat hunched on an overturned paint bucket. He had completely abandoned the dead peeling machine, returning to the house to grab a heavy kitchen knife of his own. His back was stiff, his grease-stained knuckles bruised from his frantic work with the wrench, but he silently matched his wife's relentless pace, root for heavy root. At 3 in the morning, the heavy bamboo doors of the shed softly creaked open. The cold, pre-dawn fog rolled in over the damp concrete floor, bringing with it a quiet, familiar figure. Bartang walked in, wrapped tightly in her thick woolen shawl. She didn't scold them for being awake, nor did she ask a single question about the smoking motor. She simply picked up a spare knife, pulled up a wooden crate, and sat right down in the dirt beside Tu Na. No one spoke a word. In the quiet, synchronized rhythm of 3 knives working the earth, a profound truth emerged. The hidden cost of building a better life is always paid in lost sleep, in sweat, and in raw, blistered hands. But family strength isn't declared in grand speeches. It is quietly proven by exactly who pulls up a chair in the dirt to help you carry the weight. When the pale golden light of morning finally broke through the garden gate, the mountain of unpeeled roots was significantly smaller. The first massive batch of pristine starch was safely soaking in the concrete washing vats, rescued from the fast-ticking clock of decay. Tu Na slowly stood up, wiping her exhausted face with the back of her wrist. She left a faint powdery streak of white starch across her cheek. Alex walked over, gently wrapping his aching, heavy arms around her shoulders. Together they walked out of the cold, damp shed and stepped up onto the warm wooden porch of their home. The suffocating panic of the night had burned away, leaving behind a deep, exhausting gratitude. The familiar, quiet warmth of their simple house wrapped around them like a blanket. The screen door squeaked open, and little Henry padded out in his yellow pajamas. He held a clean, damp cloth in his small hands. Reaching up on his tiptoes, he carefully wiped the white starch from his mother's tired face. "We learned a brutal, beautiful lesson last night. True growth isn't about perfectly avoiding disaster, it is about surviving it side by side. We still have a daunting pile of roots waiting in the yard and a broken machine to fix." But as we sat together on the porch, sharing a steaming pot of bitter green tea in the morning chill, the fear was entirely gone. A home isn't held together by perfect machinery or flawless plans. It is held together by the hands that simply refuse to stop working for the people they love. Have you ever had to step up and do the impossible when your plans fell apart? Please share your story with us in the comments below. If this late-night lesson touched your heart, please leave a like to support our family's journey.